Hi, everyone, and welcome to Remaking Tomorrow, a series of conversations about the future of teaching and learning. I'm Greg Baer, co-author with Ryan Rudzeski of When You Wonder You're Learning, Mr. Rogers' enduring lessons for raising creative, curious, caring kids. And I regularly get to spend this podcast time with you, and today I'm joined by a very special co-host, Kathy Hirsch-Pasek, a former guest and co-host. And apart from me and Ryan, she's appeared on this podcast more than anyone else. Kathy is a professor of psychology at Temple University, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and the author of more than a dozen books, including Becoming Brilliant, What the Science Tells Us About Raising Successful Children, and School's Work, Bringing the Science of Learning to Joyful Classroom Practice. Welcome back, Kathy.
Thank you. It's always great to be with you, Greg.
This is a podcast powered by Remake Learning, a network that ignites engaging and relevant learning in support of young people navigating rapid social and technological change.
And on today's episode, we're talking with my good friend Bob Pianta, a professor of early childhood education at the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development. Bob is internationally recognized as an expert in early childhood and K-12 education, and he's co-author of the fantastic new book, Kids on Earth, The Learning Potential of 5 Billion Minds. Bob, thanks for being here, and welcome to Remaking Tomorrow.
Thanks, Kathy, for that introduction, and thanks, Greg, for your support of all this good work that's going on.
Bob, it is such an honor to have you here on the podcast. Thank you for being here. Together with Howard Blumenthal, you wrote this book, Kids on Earth, and before we get into the vision that it presents about the future of education and learning, I want to talk about something that you did that was extraordinary. You went straight to the source. You interviewed children and teenagers from more than 70 countries, along with their parents, teachers, and other learning experts. So before we dive into all sorts of insights, tell us, what was it like to talk to the world's kids?
Aside from what you can't escape, which is the stunning variation in the circumstances under which kids grow up and the stunningly different configurations of opportunities and challenges, there's a remarkable consistency across all of them in the way that they are thinking ahead, that they are fundamentally future-oriented and not past-oriented. And they are very aware of the challenges that the future poses for them, challenges like health and economy and inequality and climate. And they want to engage in those, and they want school to help them do that. Now, Howard deserves enormous credit for those interviews, and this has been part of his long-running project to interview kids.
So, Bob, you gave such a beautiful description of what's going on in schools today and how in an attention economy, it kind of isn't working. And I just wanted to pull one quote and then have you move on. In what you called the old school, you said students are very interested in science, less so in learning everything that a science curriculum insists they must be taught, the memorize, the must remember for the upcoming tests. The current approach is buzzkill, because there's too much information and not enough relevant to the student's individual interests or experience. You then talk about a vision for the new school that stands in contrast to the methods that we're doing right now. Help me understand what each of these pillars means to you and how they can give us a cohesive vision for the future of learning environments that we're not seeing right now.
So just to go back to the first question, what an awful lot of the kids, when we spoke to them about their experiences in school, it's an awful lot of what they said, which was that they felt boxed in by the curriculum. The curriculum had become narrowed over time and less relevant to their lives and largely overly structured and, in a sense, overstuffed with things that they had to memorize that they found had less relevance. And at the same time, they would talk about all sorts of things that they were interested in working with. And I think we all, kids and adults, we think of learning as something that's authentic. Learning isn't the same as memorizing something. Learning is something that kids are challenged by, whether it's a knowledge or skill, and they have to exert effort and engagement to acquire whatever that knowledge and skill is. And it changes them when they enter that process of acquisition or skill development. And so in that sense, learning is, as we've characterized it, three, core elements, that it fundamentally is personal. And by what we mean personal is that authentic learning takes place when the student, the learner, owns it for reasons that are personally relevant to them, to their lives, to their futures, to what it is that they want to accomplish in the world, to their interests. Otherwise, when you're doing it for somebody else, it doesn't land, it doesn't stick, and it doesn't change you. The second element being relational. Kathy, you know that I study relationships between kids and teachers. And I think this is something that, quite frankly, we have completely moved away from. This pillar is almost absent in most education systems because we think of relationships as a nice side benefit. If you have a good relationship with your teacher or with kids in the classroom, it's a side benefit. And yet every single kid we talked to talked about the power of relationships in their lives in a couple different ways. So relationships are a support to learning. They're a scaffold into information. They make information and skill interesting to kids. Relationships scaffold engagement. They provide kind of a sense of security to take risks in learning. So I think we miss the value of relationships as a fundamental feature of learning, and we don't do a very good job of creating environments that capitalize upon the power of relationships. And then a sense of active engagement. We've done observations in hundreds of thousands of elementary school classrooms and preschool classrooms, and a conclusion that one will draw very quickly from those observations is that the kids are mostly passive. Most of them are very well behaved and listening to a teacher at the front of the room, but it's a very passive level of engagement. And for the most part, the lack of active engagement, of seeing oneself and feeling oneself involved in the act of learning and the act of engaging with material, is absent. And so learning that sticks for kids is personal, relational, and active. It has those three elements.
I feel like I'm talking to two amazing Loraxes, right? Who are advocates for learning that is active, learning that is personal, learning that is relational. This idea of new school that actually shouldn't be so hard to realize. And Bob, as you present new school in your book, Kids on Earth, you also talk about not school, sort of the external instruction that involves media, technology, and other forms of learning. And I have to admit, for many of us, these not school forces might feel a little bit like a distraction or a deterrent from the good things we want to be happening in schools. So when you think about those not school things like media and technology, how are they part of a positive and student-affirming vision for what school can be?
Again, I think when we spoke to kids, this is why it's so important to speak to kids and ask them about their learning. An awful lot of what they talked about was the learning that took place outside of school. So I think what not school did for us was to create a window on where an awful lot of learning is happening and to begin to look at that learning as a model for the kind of learning that we could structure for kids within schools, or at least do a better job of migrating in that direction. And again, you find these characteristics of personal, relational, and active showing up an awful lot in the not school environments, sports, all sorts of content creation. One of the things we miss a lot about kids is their capacity to innovate and create in the not school environment, to problem solve, to explore. Again, all things that we want to begin to see greater penetration of in the school environment that has been difficult to accomplish.
I think a lot of scientists, not just the two of us, have come to the same conclusion that kids want their own agency, that it's got to be meaningful to them, and that having relationships with people is key to learning. Can you give me some amazing examples of where you have seen the active, personal, and relational going on, and where kids walk away with even more learning than they might be getting in the same topic if it were taught in the old school?
Oh, I think you see it in all sorts of different configurations in different communities. Most of the not school learning really starts exploding when kids hit middle school, a little bit before middle school, that sort of late elementary when they're kind of out on their own a little bit more. Again, this varies with different community configurations and supports available to kids. But the middle school age kid, the opportunities in media seem to be almost like a magnet. So I can give you an example of a place here locally in Charlottesville, which is called Lighthouse Studios, which opened up, maybe more than a decade ago. First off, an awful lot of those young kids feel themselves marginalized by the standardized curriculum in schools. There's a space for them and their learning that oftentimes doesn't exist. And you see this over and over again in the not school world. And it's the scaffolding into various forms of media that adults can introduce kids to. And then literally, as you say, Kathy, they are off and running. You mentioned earlier in our conversation the kids who love science but not feeling like they want to memorize the science, where not school for this activity for them is a connection through an internet mediated group of kids that formed on the basis of some work that kids were doing in the classroom around a subject area had to do with reefs, like the Great Barrier Reef, for example. And kids immediately found themselves on the internet and then created a community there where they explored challenges to the reefs, climate change, examples of places in which interventions were able to be made around the ocean in a small ecological niche that then restored the balance of the reef's function. So it was just things like that over and over and over again, where environments that were able to open up in ways that created room for the variation in kids' skills and in their interests, and some opportunities for them to move into those environments to learn things of interest to them, were catalyzing to the talents and capacities of those kids.
Bob, can I just jump in for one sec to say that it also sounds like the education you're promoting is more inclusive in the sense that kids who have differences can find a home in the new school and the out of school and not school environments.
One of the bigger challenges, I think, to schools, and we have to remember that schools operate at scale. They have to educate lots and lots and lots of kids. And one solution to scale is to make things more similar so that you can kind of replicate it. At the same time, a challenge to scale and a challenge to that model is that every kid is different. Our schools, as currently structured, have a real challenge in meeting kids where they are and in accommodating that variability. So I could not agree more. The model that we are envisioning and trying to promote is one in which we'll see far greater degree of inclusion.
This is Greg Baer, here with special co-host Kathy Hirsch-Pasek. We're talking with Bob Pianta, co-author of Kids on Earth, The Learning Potential of 5 Billion Minds.
So, Bob, I've known you a long time, and I know when you're not writing provocative, future-focused books, you are also a professor at the University of Virginia, where you founded and direct the Center for Advanced Study of Teaching and Learning, and you served as the immediate past dean of the School of Education at the University of Virginia. So I wondered if you would just take us on a little journey of how you have focused on and measured teacher-student relationships and how this has taught you so much about what these relationships contribute to learning. Because I agree with you. I think it's the missing piece right now in how we educate and by the way, in how we train teachers.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kathy, and that observation. I'll try to make the journey quick. But, my connection to this really starts when I was a teacher. I was trained as a special ed teacher, got the opportunity to teach the same group of kids for 3 years in a row as sixth, seventh, and eighth graders. And I observed completely accidentally that in the beginning of my second year, I knew these kids already. And all of a sudden, I had none of the kind of behavioral challenges and sort of testing out of our connection that I did in the prior year. And I was able to then function much more smoothly as a teacher and as someone who could help guide them. And those relationships just got deeper over the course of that year and the subsequent one. But it just gave me a real motivation to try to learn more about this. And so, over time, all the opportunities I've had to engage in research and further study has been to try to understand better the processes of relationships and how they work to support human development, particularly kids' development, and then how what we know about relationships can be applied to the specific relationship between a teacher and a student. So then the question became, can you measure these things? Can you improve these things? Can you do those moves in such a way that you can scale resources to teachers? And so we spent time observing in classrooms. We talked to teachers. And over time, what that evolved into was a set of tools that would allow observers to go in and be able to gauge the quality of a relational connection between a teacher and a student through observing the teacher's behaviors. And those tools then became the basis of a set of supports that we created for teachers, coaching, college classrooms, online courses, which were tested in experiments. And in each particular case, when we provide teachers with what we call a language and a lens for their interactions with kids, their interactions with kids improved, and not surprisingly, the kids' learning improved. We had one study where we did this in high schools where relationships between teachers and kids is not a topic that comes up a lot in teachers' understanding of their role. And we supported teachers to pay attention to their interactions with kids, to pay attention to kids' perceptions of those interactions. And over the course of 8 to 10 coaching cycles, kids became more engaged in the learning opportunities in the classroom. And not surprisingly, not only did their attitudes change, but quite frankly, their scores on the state test performance jumped 10 percentile points. This is a huge resource to kids that is untapped. And it's also a resource to teachers. And the more that we can make those connections explicit and provide them support and training, the better.
Bob, I'm listening to you and I'm still kind of wowed. A 10 percentage point change in outcomes? That is insane. So here we are in 2025, and you're like writing a book about building a scalable global framework for radical educational change. So look back on your career. How has education changed and how has it not? And why is this the moment for radical educational change?
Looking back, the last 35 years, one of the things that I thought was and has been extraordinarily promising in education over this time, I'll even give No Child Left Behind credit on this, which was to pay attention to what kids are exposed to in schools, build systems of collecting information about their learning, use the data that you gather from those systems to try to improve environments for them. I think what was missing from all of that was a perspective on the kids' own experience of all of the machinery of standards-based reform, of sitting in a classroom and kind of learning the same stuff that all the other kids were learning, of having to learn something for a test, of being assessed a lot. And I think our overall education system, while starting in a good place and with a good set of premises and ideas, just kept ratcheting further and further over the decades into one that really became common denominators, one size fits all. We talk to teachers, they teach as a function of pacing guides. And it missed out on what was happening, in a sense, under the hood. And I think it was a lot of our observational work in classrooms that shed light for me on the ways in which those environments that we allowed to ratchet in that direction were becoming places that were actually starting to turn kids off. So then starting a decade ago, we began to see the decline of surveys of kids' engagement starting at about fourth grade. Again, not surprising given what kind of environments that we were offering them. The pandemic came along and was really a very demoralizing and debilitating, capacity leaching experience. As we come out of the pandemic, it's no surprise we see all these test scores that we see, particularly in the US, but we see this all globally. And I am not optimistic when I see the solutions that have been promoted over and over again really just kind of be more of the same. Let's give kids more instructional time of the stuff that we're already teaching them in the ways that we're already teaching them. We see social engagement as a kind of well-being as a nice thing to have, not the core element of their experience in school. So I am utterly convinced that we need fresher ideas, new ideas. The challenge is to identify those ideas and models, develop them and scale them in a way that provides a counter model to the model that has been the dominant one for the last 4 decades.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, because I will tell you, it's like no business would make it if they just kept doing what wasn't working. And that seems to be our modus operandi here. It's terrible.
I think that's right, Kathy. Yeah.
Bob, as we bring this conversation to a close, we want to ask a few personal questions that help to answer what makes Bob Bob. So you began your career as a special education teacher. Can you share with us a lesson you learned from a peer teacher that sticks with you still today?
I had the great pleasure of being in a special ed resource classroom, which I shared with other teachers. And one in particular, Annette Moed, who was my kind of colleague in my first couple of years, gave me some real important advice and feedback about using kids' interest as a source of motivation and engagement for them. I was working on language development with the kids and had sort of a language development program, vocabulary development, and her feedback to me prompted me to turn that language part of the curriculum into a studio where the kids would put together a news program each week. And we would use the vocabulary words and the language kind of structures that we were trying to work on in the context of creating a media production. And all of a sudden, teaching became a whole lot easier and kids did a whole lot more learning.
Who is a teacher in your own life who helped you to find joy and fascination and the path on which you still find yourself today?
I had an English teacher, John Hamilton, who was just a remarkable support to adolescents trying to figure out their way through the world, and modeled in a way that I experienced very directly this connection between learning and relationships. He was an extraordinary support, still a close friend, and someone who created an openness for adolescents to be themselves while at the same time we're trying to wrestle with whatever the novel of the month was.
And before we go, just one more question. What's one thing that parents and educators can do today to make tomorrow a more promising place for every learner?
Listen to those learners, understanding that student, that child, that adolescent has a perspective that's their own. And your job as a listener is to understand that perspective, not to summarize what the kid says or impose your perspective or provide feedback on their perspective. Your job is to be quiet and observe and listen and be curious about who that young person is and to understand their perspective on their life and on their world and on their opportunities. And if you do that, that unlocks a pathway to engage them in the way that you can engage them, which is as a guide and a support in their own learning journey.
Thanks again to award-winning and internationally celebrated education professor Bob Pianta, whose most recent book is Kids on Earth, The Learning Potential of 5 Billion Minds. Remaking Tomorrow is powered by Remake Learning. Learn more at remakelearning.org.